How can a single dog read ice better than trained soldiers who've spent months learning Arctic survival? What hidden instincts allow an animal to cross frozen surfaces that killed experienced men just hours before? And why was an American mountain infantry battalion trapped so deep in the frozen woods of northern Norway, cut off from supply lines, facing pneumonia outbreaks, watching their wounded die, knowing that if medicine didn't arrive within 24 hours, half the unit would be beyond saving? The answers to those questions rested in the paws and instincts of Kodiak, a 100-pound Alaskan Malamute who'd been raised by Inuit handlers in conditions that made this Norwegian winter seem almost mild by comparison. But on the morning of February 14, 1945, as Captain Nathan Cross stood at the edge of what his maps called Lake Storven and watched ice plates shift under their own weight with sounds like distant gunfire, those answers felt as remote as the supply depot 12 miles away that held the medical supplies his men desperately needed. The 99th Mountain Infantry Battalion had been operating in this sector for 6 weeks, supporting Norwegian resistance units and harassing German supply routes through terrain so hostile that both sides spent more energy fighting the environment than each other. The forests were ancient spruce and pine growing so dense that daylight barely penetrated even at noon. Snow depth averaged 4 feet in the valleys, 8 feet in the drifts, with temperatures that hadn't risen above -20 Fahrenheit in 3 weeks. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite despite constant vigilance. Equipment froze and shattered. Weapons required heating before they'd function. It was warfare at the edge of human endurance, where nature killed more efficiently than enemy action. The German offensive had come without warning 72 hours earlier, a coordinated push by ski-mobile infantry units that collapsed the mountain passes the Americans had been using for resupply. The attack was tactically brilliant, cutting the battalion off from friendly forces while avoiding direct engagement that would have favored American defensive positions. Now Cross commanded 340 men in a valley with no viable exit routes, dwindling ammunition, food for perhaps 4 more days, and a medical crisis that was already killing soldiers faster than German bullets ever had. The blizzard that hit on the second night of their isolation destroyed what remained of their supply infrastructure. Wind gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour shredded tents, scattered equipment, and killed the sled dogs that had been their primary means of moving supplies through terrain where vehicles couldn't operate. Of the 12 dogs they'd had, only 3 survived, and 2 of those were injured badly enough that Lieutenant Sam Morgan, the battalion's veterinary officer, wasn't sure they'd last another week. That left Kodiak as their only fully functional sled dog, an animal whose value had just increased beyond any calculation Cross could make. The pneumonia outbreak started small. 2 men with respiratory symptoms that seemed manageable with the limited medical supplies they had. But in conditions where men couldn't stay warm, couldn't get proper rest, and were already weakened by weeks of inadequate nutrition and constant cold exposure, pneumonia spread with terrifying speed. By the morning of the 3rd day, 17 men showed symptoms ranging from mild fever to full respiratory distress. The battalion surgeon, Captain David Chen, had exhausted his supply of sulfa drugs and was watching men deteriorate with the helpless frustration of a doctor who knew exactly what treatment was needed, but lacked the means to provide it. Chen's assessment to Cross had been brutally direct. "Sir, without antibiotics and proper fever management drugs, I'm going to lose at least 8 men in the next 48 hours, probably more. The cold is accelerating everything. Their bodies can't fight infection when they're using every calorie just to maintain core temperature. We need medical supplies, and we need them now, not 3 days from now, when a relief column might fight its way through German positions." The nearest supply depot that hadn't been overrun was 12 miles northeast, situated at a Norwegian resistance camp that Allied forces had been supporting throughout the winter. Radio contact confirmed they had the needed medical supplies, sulfa drugs, morphine, fever reducers, wound dressing, everything Chen required to stabilize his patients. The problem was the route. Direct travel would require crossing Lake Storvan, a body of water 3 miles across that had frozen solid in December, but was now showing dangerous instability from artillery vibrations, temperature fluctuations, and the chaotic ice dynamics that made Arctic lakes deadly, even when they appeared safely frozen. Cross had sent a 4-man reconnaissance patrol to assess the lake crossing the previous day. 3 men returned, The fourth, Corporal Anderson, had broken through ice that looked solid from 10 feet away, the freezing water pulling him under before his squad mates could reach him with ropes. The survivors reported that the lake was a death trap, ice plates shifting independently, pressure ridges creating weak zones invisible under snow cover, and sections where artillery concussions from distant German bombardments had fractured the surface into a mosaic of stability and danger that changed hour by hour. No human could cross safely. The risk calculation was simple and brutal. Sending men meant losing them with near certainty, and losing more soldiers wouldn't help the ones already dying from pneumonia. But Morgan, who'd worked with sled dogs since before the war and understood their capabilities better than anyone in the battalion, had proposed an alternative that sounded insane until Cross considered their complete lack of better options. "Sir, Kodiak can make that crossing," Morgan had said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd spent months working with the animal. "Dogs read ice differently than we do. They sense vibrations through their paws, detect hollow sounds that indicate weak spots, and instinctively avoid areas where the surface isn't stable." Kodiak was trained by Inuit handlers who used dogs for exactly this kind of travel. He's crossed thin ice before, probably dozens of times. If we rig a light pack with essential medical supplies, maybe 20 pounds maximum, he can carry it across and back. The idea of betting dying men's lives on a dog's ability to navigate ice that had already killed a trained soldier should have been dismissed immediately. But Cross was out of conventional options. Relief forces were still fighting to break through German positions and wouldn't arrive for days at minimum. Airdrops were impossible in the current weather conditions, and every hour of delay meant more men sliding past the point where medicine could save them. Sometimes command meant choosing between options that all seemed wrong and picking the one that was least catastrophic. Cross made the decision that would determine whether his leadership was remembered as desperate brilliance or criminal incompetence. Prepare Kodiak for the crossing. Pack the absolute minimum medical supplies Chen needs: antibiotics, fever drugs, morphine. Make it light enough that the dog can move fast, but substantial enough to actually help if he makes it through. And Morgan, understand this clearly. I'm sending that dog on a mission that will probably kill him because I don't have any other choice. If there was another way, I'd take it. Morgan had simply nodded, understanding that some decisions couldn't be softened by explanation or justification. He'd worked with Kodiak since the dog was assigned to the battalion 4 months earlier, had learned the animal's capabilities and limitations through daily interaction that built the kind of partnership essential for effective working dog operations. If anyone could prepare Kodiak for this crossing and give him maximum chance of survival, it was Morgan. If this opening has pulled you into Kodiak's story, if you're wondering whether a sled dog can truly navigate ice that defeated trained soldiers, make sure you're subscribed to follow this mission to its conclusion. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on working animals in extreme conditions and the impossible tasks they've accomplished throughout military history. Hit that like button and share this with anyone who appreciates authentic stories of courage that transcend species. The next chapters will show you exactly what Kodiak faced on that frozen lake, and why sometimes survival depends on trusting instincts that human training can never replicate. Morgan worked through the early morning preparing Kodiak for the crossing, every action deliberate despite the urgency pressing on them all. The dog stood patiently while Morgan checked paws for cuts or cracks that might worsen during extended travel on ice, applied protective salve to pad surfaces, and fitted him with a modified harness designed to distribute weight evenly across his chest and shoulders, rather than concentrating stress on any single point. The medical pack Chen had assembled weighed 18 pounds, sulfa tablets in waterproof containers, morphine ampules wrapped in insulating material, fever reducers, and compressed bandaging that could treat a dozen serious wounds. Kodiak tolerated the preparation with the calm focus of an animal accustomed to work. His brown eyes tracked Morgan's movements, ears swiveling to catch sounds from the camp where sick men coughed in rhythm that carried across frozen air. The dog had been around illness before, had learned during previous missions that human distress meant his work was needed. Whether he understood the specific stakes of this crossing was unknowable, but his posture suggested readiness rather than reluctance. Cross joined them at the lake's edge as Morgan completed final adjustments to the pack harness. The ice stretched before them, a white expanse broken by pressure ridges where colliding plates had buckled upward into jagged barriers that could be 3 feet high or 30 depending on the forces that created them. Wind had scoured some sections clean, revealing ice so clear you could see water flowing beneath. Other areas were buried under snow that concealed surface conditions completely. From shore, it looked like a frozen desert, beautiful, hostile, and utterly indifferent to human need. "He knows the basic route," Morgan explained, pointing across the lake toward the barely visible opposite shore. "Dogs navigate by landmarks and scent patterns we can't detect. The supply depot is northeast, and prevailing wind carries scent from that direction. Kodiak's been there before during supply runs, so he knows the destination. What I can't predict is how he'll handle route deviations when he encounters unstable ice. Dogs generally avoid danger, but if the safe path becomes too circuitous, he might try to push through marginal ice rather than backtrack." Cross studied the lake through binoculars, noting areas where ice appeared darker, potential weak zones where thickness was insufficient, or where water moved underneath with enough current to prevent solid freezing. "What are his actual chances? Give me a realistic assessment, not optimism." Morgan was silent for a moment, watching Kodiak test the ice at the shoreline with careful paw placement that suggested the dog was already evaluating surface stability. "Honestly, sir, maybe 60% he makes it across. 40% he breaks through somewhere, and we lose both him and the medicine. But that's still better odds than sending men, and it's infinitely better than doing nothing while soldiers die from treatable infections." The calculation was cold but accurate. Cross had already made peace with sending the dog on a mission that would probably kill him, because the alternative was accepting deaths that were absolutely certain. Command in extreme conditions meant making choices between terrible options and living with consequences regardless of outcome. He nodded to Morgan. "Send him." Morgan knelt beside Kodiak, speaking in the low, calm tone the dog had learned to associate with mission preparation. The words themselves probably didn't matter. Dogs responded more to tone and body language than vocabulary. But the ritual of briefing helped Morgan as much as the animal. He pointed across the lake, repeated the destination name, and gave the command that released Kodiak from waiting to active work. The dog started across the ice with measured steps, testing each footfall before committing full weight, reading the surface through senses humans didn't possess. His gait was careful, but not fearful, the movement of an animal that understood ice and respected its dangers without being paralyzed by them. The medical pack rode securely on his back, positioned to minimize interference with natural movement while keeping the load stable through whatever terrain he encountered. For the first 100 yards, Kodiak followed a relatively straight course, finding ice that was thick enough to support him without concerning hesitation. Morgan watched through binoculars, tracking the dog's progress and noting how Kodiak occasionally paused to test areas before proceeding, behavior that suggested he was actively evaluating ice stability rather than just following a memorized route. That ability to assess and adapt in real time was what gave him advantage over human crossers who relied on visual inspection that could miss fatal weaknesses hidden beneath snow cover. The first pressure ridge appeared as a wall of broken ice plates thrust upward by forces that had compressed the lake surface during freezing. Kodiak approached it carefully, circling to find a passable section rather than attempting to climb directly over the jagged barrier. He found a gap where ice blocks had settled into a natural ramp, picked his way through with the caution of an animal that knew falling could mean injury that ended the mission. On the far side, he paused to shake snow from his coat, then continued northeast toward the objective Morgan had indicated. Cross lowered his binoculars after watching Kodiak disappear into the broken terrain of mid-lake pressure ridges. "How long until we know if he made it?" 4 hours to cross, maybe 5 if he encounters significant obstacles. Another hour at the depot while they transfer medical supplies to waterproof containers suitable for the return trip. Then 4 to 5 hours back, assuming he doesn't rest. Morgan checked his watch against the pale sunlight barely visible through overcast that promised more snow before evening. "Call it 10 hours minimum, 14 if conditions are difficult. We should know by nightfall whether this worked or whether I just sent our last working dog to his death for nothing." The waiting was harder than the decision had been. Cross returned to his command post, reviewing defensive positions and contingency plans while trying not to calculate how many men might die during the hours Kodiak was crossing ice that could swallow him in seconds. Chen made his rounds through the aid station, doing what little he could with exhausted supplies while watching pneumonia patients deteriorate at rates that medical training had taught him to recognize as pre-terminal without intervention that he couldn't provide. German ski patrols had been active throughout the isolation, probing American positions without committing to full assault. Intelligence suggested the enemy was content to let winter and isolation do their work, avoiding casualties while waiting for the trapped battalion to weaken enough that overrunning them would require minimal effort. Cross had positioned scouts to watch likely approach routes, but he knew that if Germans decided to attack before relief arrived, his undermanned and illness-depleted force couldn't hold for more than a few hours. 4 hours after Kodiak departed, scouts reported movement on the lake, a single dog returning from the northeast, moving faster than the outbound journey, the gait suggesting urgency rather than exhaustion. Morgan grabbed binoculars and confirmed what the scouts had seen. Kodiak was coming back, the medical pack still secured to his harness, which meant he'd reached the depot and been loaded with the supplies Chen needed. The return crossing was happening ahead of the minimum time estimate, suggesting the dog had found efficient routes and was pushing hard to complete the mission. But between Kodiak and the American shore, a new complication had developed. German ski patrol, 8 soldiers moving in tactical formation across the frozen lake, their route intersecting with the course Kodiak would need to follow to reach safety. Whether they'd spotted the dog was unclear, but if they had, they'd certainly recognize that a laden sled dog meant American forces were attempting resupply. Capturing or killing Kodiak would deny the battalion its medicine and eliminate their last working dog simultaneously. Morgan spotted the German patrol through binoculars, counting 8 soldiers moving in the dispersed tactical formation that ski troops used when crossing open terrain. They were perhaps a mile from shore, their white winter camouflage making them difficult to track against snow-covered ice. More concerning was their bearing. They were angling northeast in a pattern that would intersect Kodiak's most direct route back to American positions within the next 20 minutes. Cross arrived at the observation post as Morgan was calculating intercept points and timing. Can he avoid them? Depends on whether they've spotted him already. If Kodiak sees them first, he'll detour around. Dogs have better distance vision than humans, and he's been trained to avoid enemy patrols during solo operations. But if they spot him before he detects them, they might pursue. German ski troops can move faster than a loaded dog, especially over open ice. Morgan kept his binoculars trained on both Kodiak and the patrol, watching the geometry of their movements. We need to give him warning if possible. Something that tells him there's danger without alerting the Germans to our presence. Cross considered options that were all variations of bad. Firing warning shots would alert Germans to American positions and potentially draw return fire or artillery. Using signal flares would be equally obvious. Radio communication was impossible. Kodiak couldn't receive transmissions. They were reduced to hoping the dog's situational awareness detected the threat before walking into an encounter he couldn't survive. Kodiak's behavior changed suddenly. The dog stopped, head turning toward the Germans even though they were still too distant for visual contact. His ears went flat, posture shifting from mission-focused movement to cautious assessment. He'd detected something, scent carried on wind, sounds transmitted through ice, or some combination of sensory input that warned him of nearby humans who weren't friendly. For several seconds he remained motionless, processing information, then began moving again on a course that angled away from the patrol's track. Morgan felt tension ease slightly. He knows they're there. He's detouring to avoid contact. The relief was premature. Kodiak's new route took him toward an area where ice appeared darker through the binoculars, possibly indicating thinner coverage or water movement underneath. The dog was trading one danger for another, choosing potential ice failure over certain contact with enemy forces. The German patrol continued their original bearing, apparently unaware of the dog whose route had just diverged from their intersection point. They were searching for something, probably investigating reports of American positions or looking for signs of attempted supply movement. If they'd been tasked with interdicting American resupply efforts, Finding and killing a sled dog carrying medicine would be exactly the kind of mission success their commanders wanted. Kodiak reached the darker ice section and slowed, testing each step with the careful deliberation Morgan had seen during the outbound journey. The surface held, though how thick it was remained unknowable from shore. The dog moved forward in careful increments, spreading his weight, reading vibrations that warned of instability before visual cues appeared. It was the navigation skill that made this crossing possible. Human instinct would have avoided the dark ice entirely, choosing routes that looked safer but might actually be more dangerous because they concealed weaknesses under snow cover. A crack opened suddenly beneath Kodiak's rear paws, the sound carrying across the lake like a rifle shot. The dog lunged forward, shifting weight to front legs while rear legs scrambled for purchase on ice that was fracturing in real time. For a terrible moment, it seemed he would break through completely, but his forward momentum carried him onto thicker ice, and he pulled himself clear of the weak section that was now visibly opening into a gap of dark water. The Germans heard the crack and stopped, turning toward the sound. Through binoculars, Morgan could see them scanning the ice, looking for the source of noise that shouldn't exist on a stable frozen surface. One pointed in Kodiak's general direction, but at this distance the dog was just a small dark shape against white background, potentially visible but not immediately identifiable as anything specific. Kodiak kept moving, faster now, apparently aware that the noise had attracted attention he couldn't afford. His route curved back toward the American shore, accepting the risk of closer approach to German positions because the alternative was remaining on unstable ice that had already nearly killed him. The medical pack bounced against his back with each bounding stride, the precious cargo holding together, despite impacts that would have shattered glass vials if Chen hadn't packed everything with careful attention to shock absorption. The German patrol began moving again, this time angling toward where they'd heard the ice crack. Whether they were investigating potential American activity or simply curious about an anomalous sound, their new bearing would bring them closer to Kodiak's position than the original intercept point would have. Morgan calculated distances and speeds, concluding that if Kodiak maintained his current pace, he'd reach shore before Germans could close to effective rifle range. But effective rifle range was several hundred yards, and a dog running across open ice was a target German marksmen might attempt even at distance that made hitting unlikely. The final mile of Kodiak's crossing became a race without the participants fully recognizing they were competing. The dog focused on reaching shore in safety, navigating around pressure ridges and testing ice that grew more stable as water depth decreased near land. Germans advanced on their investigation, still uncertain what they'd heard, but moving with the tactical discipline of soldiers who'd learned that anomalies in enemy territory deserved attention. Morgan had positioned riflemen at the shoreline with orders to provide covering fire if Germans came within threatening range of Kodiak. The rules of engagement were clear. Don't initiate contact unless the dog's survival required it. But if Germans aimed weapons at Kodiak, kill them before they could shoot. It was a narrow decision space that reflected their desperate situation. They couldn't afford a firefight that would reveal their positions and invite retaliation, but they also couldn't let Germans kill the dog carrying medicine that would save 8 men's lives. Kodiak reached shore with Germans still 400 yards distant. Morgan waded into knee-deep snow at the lake's edge, calling the dog with hand signals and the tone that meant mission complete, safety achieved, rest available. Kodiak bounded the final distance and collapsed at Morgan's feet, flanks heaving, ice clinging to his fur. Exhaustion finally claiming the reserves that had carried him through 10 hours of continuous effort, in conditions that would have killed lesser animals. The Germans watched from the ice but didn't pursue onto land where American defensive positions would turn pursuit into suicide. After several minutes of observation, they turned back toward their own lines, apparently satisfied that whatever they'd heard didn't warrant further investigation. The threat passed, and with it the immediate danger that had made the final minutes of Kodiak's return more terrifying than the entire crossing. Chen didn't wait for formal handoff procedures. The moment Morgan removed the medical pack from Kodiak's harness, the surgeon was opening waterproof containers and conducting rapid inventory of what the supply depot had sent. Sulfa tablets in quantities sufficient for treating 20 patients through full-course therapy. Morphine ampules that would ease suffering even if they couldn't cure underlying conditions. fever reducers that could buy critical hours while antibiotics did their work. It was exactly what he'd requested, packed with the efficiency of people who understood that minutes mattered when dealing with pneumonia in extreme cold. The first doses were administered within 10 minutes of Kodiak's return. Chen prioritized the 8 most critical cases, men whose respiratory distress had progressed to the point where death was measured in hours rather than days. Each patient received sulfa tablets and fever medication, with morphine reserved for those whose pain had become unmanageable. The response wasn't immediate. Antibiotics required time to take effect, but Chen knew from experience that if they'd intervened before irreversible organ damage occurred, most of these men would survive. Morgan worked on Kodiak with the same urgency Chen applied to human patients. The dog had pushed himself beyond normal endurance limits, running for 10 hours in conditions that would exhaust fresh animals in 2. His paw pads showed abrasions from ice contact. One front leg had a minor laceration from breaking through the weak ice section, and his core temperature was lower than ideal, despite thick fur that provided natural insulation. Morgan wrapped him in blankets salvaged from destroyed tents, provided water and high-calorie rations, and kept him close to one of the few functioning heating stoves where warmth might accelerate recovery. Cross conducted his evening command brief with the knowledge that the immediate medical crisis was being addressed, though broader tactical problems remained unsolved. German forces still surrounded them, relief columns were still fighting to break through enemy positions, and their isolation would continue for at least another 48 hours according to the latest radio intelligence. The medicine Kodiak had delivered would save lives, but it didn't solve their fundamental problem of being cut off in hostile territory with limited supplies and an enemy that grew stronger while they grew weaker. The temperature dropped as darkness came, falling to -32 Fahrenheit according to the last functioning thermometer. At these temperatures, exposed skin froze in minutes. Weapons required constant attention to prevent mechanisms from seizing, and human endurance became a battle against physiology that demanded more calories than their reduced rations provided. Soldiers huddled in whatever shelter existed, sharing body warmth, rotating positions so no one stayed static long enough to lose extremities to frostbite. Chen made rounds through the aid station at midnight, checking on patients who'd received the first doses of medication hours earlier. The response was encouraging. Fevers were dropping, respiratory sounds were improving, and the immediate crisis that had threatened 8 lives was stabilizing into manageable illness that time, and continued treatment would resolve. He found Cross in the command post and delivered the assessment both men needed to hear. "Sir, we're going to save them. All 8 of the critical cases are responding to treatment. I'll need to continue sulfa therapy for at least 5 days, and some will have lingering respiratory issues that require rest and warmth we can't really provide. But barring complications, they'll survive." Chen paused, exhaustion making his words slightly slurred. "That dog did what we couldn't. He crossed ice that killed Anderson, evaded German patrols, and delivered medicine that will directly save 8 lives, probably more when you count the less critical cases I can now treat with supplies I was hoarding for the worst patients." Cross nodded, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction that was rare in their current situation. They'd faced an impossible problem, made a desperate decision, and somehow achieved success against odds that suggested failure was nearly certain. Kodiak had performed exactly as Morgan promised, navigating dangers that would have defeated human capability, and returned with cargo that meant the difference between tragedy and survival. Morgan reported that Kodiak was recovering well, sleeping deeply in a position near the stove, where warmth accelerated his body's natural healing processes. The dog would need several days' rest before being fit for further work, but his injuries weren't serious enough to prevent full recovery. In a week, assuming they survived that long, Kodiak would be capable of additional missions if circumstances required them. The night passed without German assault, suggesting enemy forces were content to maintain siege rather than risk casualties attacking entrenched positions. Cross used the respite to strengthen defenses, redistribute ammunition, and prepare contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop. The medicine had bought them time by ensuring his force wouldn't be further reduced by preventable deaths, but time was only valuable if relief arrived before their other limitations became critical. Dawn on the 4th day of isolation brought weather that promised worse conditions ahead. Dark clouds massed to the northwest. the atmospheric pressure dropped perceptible even without instruments, and wind patterns shifted in ways that experienced soldiers recognized as precursors to major storms. Cross studied the sky with the grim knowledge that a blizzard now would complicate everything: German assault timing, relief force movement, and their own ability to maintain defensive positions in conditions where visibility would drop to arm's length and temperatures would fall to levels that killed through exposure alone. The medical situation continued improving. Chen's morning rounds confirmed that all 8 critical patients were past immediate danger, their fevers controlled, breathing easier, though still weak enough that combat effectiveness was weeks away rather than days. The less serious pneumonia cases were responding to treatment ahead of the optimistic timeline Chen had projected. Kodiak's crossing had bought them exactly what they needed: time for medicine to work while relief forces fought through German positions. Radio contact with regimental headquarters brought mixed news. The relief column was making progress but encountering stiff resistance at every defensible position between their starting point and the isolated battalion. German forces were fighting delaying actions designed to slow American advance without committing to battles they couldn't win, trading time for the winter conditions that remained their most effective ally. Current estimates suggested relief was still 36 to 48 hours away, assuming weather didn't deteriorate enough to halt movement entirely. Kodiak emerged from his recovery rest on the morning of day 4, moving stiffly, but showing interest in food and surroundings that indicated he was healing well. Morgan conducted thorough examination, checking paws for infection or damage that might not have been apparent during initial treatment. The dog was fit enough for light duty, but not ready for another crossing like the one that had saved the battalion. That limitation didn't matter. They had the medicine they needed, and unless circumstances changed dramatically, Kodiak wouldn't be required for additional solo missions. German activity increased throughout the day, with ski patrols probing American positions more aggressively than previous reconnaissance efforts. Cross interpreted this as preparation for assault, enemy forces gathering final intelligence before committing to attack. They'd been delaying while waiting for the trapped battalion to weaken. The fact that Germans were moving toward active engagement suggested they'd received intelligence that relief forces were approaching and wanted to eliminate the isolated Americans before having to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. The storm arrived at 1400 hours with winds that went from calm to 60 miles per hour in less than 10 minutes. Visibility collapsed to near zero as snow fell so thick it seemed more liquid than solid, driven horizontally by wind that found every gap in clothing and shelter. Temperatures plunged 15 degrees in the first hour, reaching -45 Fahrenheit, where exposed metal became dangerous to touch even through gloves and frostbite could claim flesh in seconds. It was the kind of storm that suspended all military operations because survival took precedence over tactical objectives. Cross ordered everyone into the deepest shelter available, concentrating the battalion in positions that offered maximum protection from wind. Sentries remained posted, but only in pairs that could rotate every 15 minutes to prevent cold injuries. Visibility was so poor that German assault during the storm would be detected only when enemy forces were close enough to touch, but the same conditions made attacking nearly suicidal. Both sides would wait out the weather and resume operations when nature permitted warfare to continue. The storm raged through the night and into the following morning. 50 hours of wind and snow that transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. Pressure ridges on the lake built higher as wind drove snow into massive drifts. The forest became a maze of fallen branches and snow accumulation that would slow movement for days after the storm passed. Cross's defensive positions that had been carefully prepared were now buried under feet of new snow that would require hours to excavate before weapons could be effectively employed. When the storm finally broke on the morning of day 6, scouts reported movement to the west. American forces, finally breaking through German positions, advancing with tank support that had been held in reserve for exactly this kind of relief operation. The battalion's isolation was ending not through their own efforts to break out, but through the persistence of relief forces that had fought for 6 days to reach soldiers they'd almost given up as lost. The link-up occurred at noon. Relief Force Commander Colonel Marcus Webb embracing Cross with the emotion of someone who'd expected to find graves rather than living soldiers. Webb's immediate concern was medical evacuation for the pneumonia patients who needed rear-area hospital care beyond what field conditions could provide. Chen briefed him on treatment protocols, emphasizing that the sulfa drugs delivered by Kodiak had been decisive in keeping patients alive long enough for this moment. Webb's intelligence officer wanted the full story of how an isolated battalion had obtained medical resupply when all conventional routes were blocked by enemy forces. Cross provided the account, with Morgan filling in details about Kodiak's capabilities and the ice crossing that had seemed impossible until the dog proved otherwise. The relief column's medical officer examined Kodiak with professional interest, remarking that the dog's feet would be documented in veterinary records as an example of working animal capabilities in extreme conditions. Evacuation began immediately. Wounded and sick loaded onto vehicles that would carry them to field hospitals, where proper treatment could continue the recovery that emergency medicine had started. The battalion's survivors prepared to withdraw from positions they'd held through 6 days that had tested every limit of human endurance and military capability. They would march out as a unit rather than being carried out as casualties, which was victory enough in circumstances where survival itself had seemed improbable. The withdrawal from the valley took 3 days, complicated by storm damage that had made trails impassable and required engineers to clear routes through fallen timber and snowdrifts that exceeded human height in some sections. The battalion moved in convoy formation, wounded riding in heated vehicles while those still capable of walking formed security elements that guarded against German harassment that never materialized. Enemy forces had withdrawn during the storm, apparently concluding that the tactical value of engaging a reinforced American unit didn't justify the casualties such engagement would cost. Kodiak rode in Morgan's vehicle, resting on blankets that provided cushioning against the rough terrain. The dog's recovery was progressing well, though he showed a slight limp that would probably become permanent, a reminder of the ice crossing that had nearly killed him. Morgan didn't consider it a disability. If anything, the limp would serve as visible evidence of what Kodiak had accomplished when military doctrine said the mission was impossible. At the field hospital where evacuated patients received treatment, Chen tracked the 8 men whose lives Kodiak had directly saved. All were responding to continued antibiotic therapy, their pneumonia resolving at rates that confirmed the intervention had come just in time. 2 would require extended hospitalization for respiratory complications that would take weeks to fully heal. The other 6 would return to duty within a month, though probably not to frontline Arctic operations where their compromised lungs would be vulnerable to relapse in extreme cold. The official after-action report Cross submitted documented the battalion's 6-day isolation with clinical precision: German offensive, communication failures, medical crisis, supply challenges, and eventual relief. But the report's most unusual section detailed Kodiak's crossing, with supporting testimony from Morgan, Chen, and multiple witnesses who'd observed the dog's departure and return. Cross recommended Kodiak for official recognition, noting that while military decorations were typically reserved for human service members, the dog's contribution warranted acknowledgement that went beyond standard working animal commendations. The recommendation moved through command channels with surprising speed, perhaps because senior officers recognized the morale value of celebrating success in a winter campaign that had produced more setbacks than victories. Within 2 weeks, orders came down authorizing a special commendation ceremony that would formally recognize Kodiak's service in terms that acknowledged both the practical impact and the symbolic importance of what he'd accomplished. The ceremony was held at division headquarters in late February, with Cross, Morgan, and Kodiak present, alongside the 8 soldiers whose lives the medicine had saved. A brigadier general whose name carried weight in military circles presented Kodiak with a citation that read, "For extraordinary courage and capability in conducting solo resupply mission across hostile terrain under extreme conditions, directly enabling medical treatment that saved 8 American lives." Kodiak demonstrated skills and dedication that exemplify the finest traditions of military working dogs and serve as inspiration to all who serve. The general also presented Morgan with orders reassigning him to a training command where his expertise with Arctic working dogs would be used to develop doctrine and procedures for future operations in extreme cold environments. The reassignment was recognition disguised as routine personnel movement. Morgan's partnership with Kodiak had proven valuable enough that command wanted him teaching others rather than risking both handler and dog in continued frontline operations. Kodiak adapted to training command with the same competence he'd shown in combat. His role shifted from active operations to demonstration work, showing new handlers what properly trained sled dogs could accomplish and how to recognize the subtle behaviors that indicated ice stability, approaching danger, or mission-relevant environmental changes. The slight limp didn't affect his ability to demonstrate techniques, and if anything added credibility. This was a dog who'd survived real operations, not a parade ground specimen who'd never faced genuine danger. Morgan kept detailed records of Kodiak's training methods and capabilities, documentation that became required reading for anyone assigned to Arctic working dog programs. The ice crossing mission was analyzed in multiple military studies, examining how to conduct resupply operations in extreme conditions when conventional methods failed. Kodiak's achievement became a case study in trusting animal capabilities that exceeded human limitations in specific environmental contexts. The war in Europe ended 3 months later, rendering Arctic operations moot as German forces surrendered and occupation duties replaced combat operations. Morgan and Kodiak remained at the training command through the transition to peacetime military structure, their partnership continuing in educational roles that shaped how the military understood and utilized working dogs in specialized environments. When Kodiak was retired from active service in 1947, Morgan adopted him through the same process that had united countless handlers with their wartime partners. They settled in Alaska, where Morgan took a civilian position with the territorial government, advising on sled dog use for mail delivery and emergency medical transport in remote regions. Kodiak lived another 6 years, his working life over but his influence continuing through the dogs Morgan trained using methods refined during their partnership. The 8 soldiers whose lives Kodiak saved went on to their own post-war existences, families raised, careers built, normal lives made possible because a dog had crossed ice no human could navigate. Some stayed in touch with Morgan, sending annual letters that always mentioned Kodiak and expressed gratitude that felt inadequate to the debt they owed. Others disappeared into the anonymity that most veterans preferred, their survival a private knowledge rather than public story. When Kodiak died peacefully in 1953, Morgan buried him on a hillside overlooking the frozen landscape where dogs still pulled sleds through conditions that would kill unprepared humans. The marker was simple. Kodiak, sled dog, hero. He crossed the ice that couldn't be crossed. It understated what the dog had accomplished, but Morgan believed Kodiak would have preferred simplicity over elaborate recognition. The work had been enough. The lives saved justified the risks taken. Everything else was human need for ceremony that dogs didn't require. If Kodiak's story moved you, if it reminded you that courage and capability come in forms we don't always expect, share it with others who appreciate authentic military history that honors all who served, regardless of species. Subscribe to continue exploring stories that demonstrate what's possible when training, instinct, and desperate necessity combine in circumstances that test every limit. Leave your thoughts in the comments about working animals and their contributions to missions that shaped outcomes in ways official histories often overlook. These stories deserve audiences who understand that sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival rests in the paws of a dog who wouldn't accept that some crossings are impossible.